Director Comey or Admiral Rogers tell us what we are doing or what we should be doing to protect against Russian interference in future elections or any meddling with our government, or for that matter, any state sponsor, Iranians, North Koreans, Chinese, with any meddling they may be doing?
So first, I think a public discussion and acknowledgement of the activity is a good positive first step because it shines a flashlight on this, if you will. It illuminates a significant issue that I think we all have to deal with. There's a variety of ongoing efforts, both within the government as well in the private sector, in terms of how do we harden our defenses. I think we also need to have a discussion about just what, for example, does critical infrastructure mean in the 21st century? I don't think we traditionally would have thought of an election infrastructure as critical. We traditionally viewed critical infrastructure as something that generated an industrial output, aviation, electricity, finance. I don't think we've traditionally thought about it in the informational kind of dynamic. I think that's a challenge for us coming ahead, and then continued partnership between the elements within the government as well as in the private sector. That's the key to the future to me.
So just for the record, I also had a whole list of specific questions about individuals and or circumstances that don't want to be repetitive and have you say I can't comment on them, but I would anticipate when we move to classified session that this committee will be able to explore some of those situations in a little more depth. I have a couple of other questions about the Russian intervention, but I don't have enough time to get into it right now, Mr. If you could give me a couple minutes when we get to the next round. Okay, so very briefly, if you can describe the elements of the Russia's active measures in the campaign in the 2016 election. We've only got 35 seconds, but that's the first thing I want to get into about exactly what they were doing, if you can tell us anything about that.
So we saw cyber used. We saw the use of external media. We saw the use of disinformation. We saw the use of leaking of information, much of which was not altered. I mean, we saw several, if you will, common traits that we have both seen over time, as well as I would argue that the difference this time was the cyber dimension and the fact that the release of so much information that they had extracted via cyber is a primary tool to try to drive an outcome.
So in this setting, can you talk to us at all about what tools they used?
I'm not going to go into the specifics of how they executed the hacks. I apologize, no, sir.
We'll try to get into that in classified. I'll hold off for now. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Schiff's recognized for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a couple of follow-up questions. Director Comey, can you tell me what an SF-86 is?
SF-86?
Yes.
It's the standard background clearance form that all of us who are hired by the federal government and want to have access to classified information fill out.
Would someone who is an incoming national security advisor have to fill out an SF-86?
Yes, I think so.
That SF-86 require that the applicant disclose any payments received from a foreign power?
I think so. I mean, the form is the form. I think so, and foreign travel as well.
I'd make a request through you to the Justice Department or whatever IC component would have custody of Mr. Flynn's SF-86. I'd make a request that that be provided to the committee. And I yield now to Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'd like to focus my line of questioning on Russia's views toward Ukraine. In March 2014, Russia illegally annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, beginning a conflict which has effectively yet to be resolved. Admiral Rogers, can you please briefly describe, as you understand it, sir, how Russia took Crimea?
I would argue to the insertion of military force. They occupied it and physically removed it from Ukrainian control.
Sir, we've heard terms like little green men, and hybrid warfare. Can you please explain how these relate to Russia and Ukraine?
So on the Ukraine side, what we saw was over time, rather than the kind of overt kind of activity we saw to such a degree on the Crimea side, what we saw was a much bigger effort on the influence and the attempts to distance Russian actions from any potential blowback to the Russian state, if you will, and hence the use of the little green men, surrogates in military, unmarked military uniforms, the flow of information, the provision of resources to support the forcible separation of the Ukraine.
Admiral, has Russia returned Crimea back to Ukraine, sir?
No.
Do they have intentions to?
They publicly indicated that they will not.
Admiral, why does Russia even care about Ukraine?
I'm sure in their view, they view this as a primary national interest for them. It's on the immediate periphery of the Russian state.
Am I right, sir, that they see it as a part of their broader objective to influence and impact Ukraine's desire for self-determination?
Yes, I think that's part of it.
Sir, as Russia tried to claim stolen territory in Ukraine, the U.S. and the rest of the world saw the annexation for what it was, a crime. Shortly after Russia invaded, the United Nations essentially declared it a crime in a non-binding resolution. And our own government, recognizing the seriousness of the event, instituted new sanctions against Russia. Is that right, sir?
Yes, sir.
Now, this was a time where much of the world was united. Russia invaded another country and illegally annexed its territory, as we all stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Now, one person who didn't see it that way, however, was President Donald Trump. On July 30th, in an interview with ABC News, Mr. Trump said of Putin, and I quote, "He's not going into Ukraine, okay? Just so you understand, he's not going into Ukraine, all right?" End quote. Now, Admiral, hadn't Putin already gone into Ukraine 2 years before and hadn't left?
We're talking about that Crimea and influence in the Ukraine generally. Yes, sir.
And he still hasn't left, correct, sir?
Now we're starting to get into some very technical questions about the Russians physically in the Ukraine. Is it surrogates? The Crimea is a very clean example, though, to me. They outright invaded with armed military force and have annexed it.
But are they effectively still in Ukraine?
They're certainly supporting the ongoing effort in the Ukraine to split that country.
We'll get back to Mr. Trump in a minute. First, tell me, sir, what would it mean to Russia and to Putin to have sanctions lifted?
Clearly, even easing of economic impact, greater flexibility, more resources.
Now, according to NATO analysis, the Russian economy shrunk by as much as 3.5% in 2015 and had no growth in 2016, in big part because of Western sanctions, especially those against the oil and gas industry. Now, we're talking about a loss of over $135 billion just in the first year of sanctions. That's a huge sum of money. And sanctions aren't meant to push their economy over a cliff, but to put long-term pressure on Putin to change his behavior. Putin himself said in 2016 that sanctions are severely harming Russia. So we know they've had success in putting pressure on the Kremlin. Admiral, what would it mean geopolitically? Would it help legitimate Russia's illegal land grab?
Sir, I'm not in a position to talk broadly about the geopolitical implications. I mean, we have stated previously, from an intelligence perspective, we have tried to outline to policymakers the specifics of the Russian invasion of Crimea, the specifics of the continued Russian support to separatists in the Ukraine. The Russians continue to attempt to pressure and to keep the Ukraine weak.
Would it help cleave the United States from her allies?
If we remove the sanctions?
There's a lot at stake here for Russia. This is big money, big strategic implications. If they can legitimate their annexation of Crimea, what's next? Are we looking at a new Iron Curtain descending across Eastern Europe? You know, most in our country recognize what is at stake and how the United States, as a leader of the free world, is the only check on Russian expansion. So, back to Mr. Trump and his cohort. At the Republican convention in July, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, and Trump himself changed the Republican Party platform to no longer arm Ukraine. So, the same month that Trump denied Putin's role in Ukraine, his team weakened the party platform on Ukraine. And, as we have and will continue to hear, this was the same month that several individuals in the Trump orbit held secret meetings with Russian officials, some of which may have been on the topic of sanctions against Russia for their intervention in Ukraine. Now, this is no coincidence, in my opinion. In fact, the dossier written by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele alleges that Trump agreed to sideline Russian intervention in Ukraine as a campaign issue, which is effectively a priority for Vladimir Putin. There's a lot in the dossier that is yet to be proven, but increasingly, as we'll hear throughout the day, allegations are checking out. And this one seems to be as accurate as they come. In fact, there is also one pattern I want to point out before yielding back. Manafort, fired. Page, fired. Flynn, fired. Why? They were hired because of their Russian connections. They were fired. However, because their connections became public, they were effectively culpable. But they were also the fall guys. So I think after we hear Mr. Quigley's line of questioning, we might guess who could be next. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, I yield back.
I yield the balance to Representative Speer.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to our country. You know, I think it's really important as we sit here that we explain this to the American people in a way that they can understand it. Why are we talking about all of this? So my first question to each of you is Russia our adversary? Mr. Comey?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Do they intend to do us harm?
They intend to ensure, I believe, that they gain advantage at our expense.
Director Comey?
Yes, I want to be, harm can have many meanings. They're an adversary, and so they want to resist us, oppose us, undermine us in lots of different ways.
So one of the terms that we hear often is hybrid warfare. And I'd like to just give a short definition of what it is. It blends conventional warfare, irregular warfare, and cyber warfare. The aggressor intends to avoid attribution or retribution. So would you say that Russia engaged in hybrid warfare in its effort to undermine our democratic process and engage in our electoral process? Director Comey?
I don't think I would use the term warfare. I think you'd want to ask experts in the definition of war. They engaged in a multifaceted campaign of active measures to undermine our democracy and hurt one of the candidates and hope to help one of the other candidates.
I'd agree with the director.
All right. Well, thank you both. I actually think that their engagement was an act of war, an act of hybrid warfare, and I think that's why the American people should be concerned about it. Now, in terms of trying to understand this, I think of a spider web with a tarantula in the middle. And the tarantula, in my view, is Vladimir Putin, who is entrapping many people to do his bidding and to engage with him. And I would include those like Roger Stone and Carter Page and Michael Caputo and Wilbur Ross and Paul Manafort and Rex Tillerson. I'd like to focus first on Rex Tillerson in the 3 minutes I have here. He was the CEO of ExxonMobil. In 2008, he said that the likelihood of U.S.-Russia businesses was, in fact, a poor investment, that Russia was a poor investment climate. That was in 2008. In 2011, he closed a $500 billion deal with Rosneft oil. The CEO of Rosneft is Igor Sechin, who is a confidant of President Putin, second most powerful man in Russia, and probably a former KGB agent. The deal gives Exxon access to the Black Sea and the Kara Sea and Siberia for oil development. Rosneft gets minority interests in Exxon, in Texas, and the Gulf. Rex Tillerson calls Sechin a good friend. In 2012, Mr. Tillerson and Mr. Sechin go on a road show here in the United States to talk about this great deal that they had just consummated. Also in 2012, there's a video of President Putin and Mr. Tillerson toasting champagne at the deal. And in 2013, Mr. Tillerson receives the Russian Order of Friendship. And he sits right next to President Putin at the event. So my question to you, Director Comey, is it of value to President Putin, knowing what you know of him and that his interest in doing harm to us, is it of benefit to Mr. Putin to have Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State?
I can't answer that question.
Admiral Rogers?
Ma'am, I'm not in a position to answer that question.
All right. So in 2014, Igor Sechin is sanctioned. And he laments that he no longer will be able to come to the United States to motorcycle ride with Mr. Tillerson. Could you give me an understanding of what are some of the reasons that we impose sanctions? Director Comey?
On Sechin,
Well, just in general.
again, you'd have to ask an expert, but from my general knowledge, it's to punish activities that are criminal in nature, that involve war crimes, that involve violations of UN resolutions or United States law in some other way. It's to communicate and enforce foreign policy interests and values of the United States of America. That's my general sense, but an expert might describe it much better.
Admiral Rogers?
I would echo the director's comments. It's also a tool that we use to attempt to drive and shape the choices and actions of others.
So in the case of Igor Sechin, who was sanctioned by the United States, in part to draw attention to the fact that Russia had invaded Crimea, it's an effort to try and send a very strong message to Russia. Is that not true?
I think that's right.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back for now.
Gentleman yields back. I'll yield myself 15 minutes and now yield to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frost-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's never acceptable, we can all agree, for any foreign power to interfere with our electoral process. And this committee has long been focused on Russia's reprehensible conduct, and we will remain focused on the threat emanating from Moscow. And I agree with you, Director Comey, when you say this investigation that is ongoing, we will follow the facts wherever they lead on a bipartisan level, and there will be no sacred cows. There are many important issues at stake, as you gentlemen have heard. There is bipartisan agreement on the danger of illegal leaks and our ability to reauthorize important programs upon which our intelligence community relies. But I want to assure the American people that there's also bipartisan agreement on getting to the bottom of Russian meddling in our election, which must remain the focus of this investigation and yours. So, Admiral Rogers, I agree in what you said, that a public acknowledgement of this foreign meddling to be a problem is important as we move forward. And following on Congressman LaBiando's questions and based on this theme, I'd like to ask you, gentlemen, if you could describe what, if anything, Russia did in this election that, to your knowledge, they did or they didn't do in previous elections? How were their actions different in this election than in previous ones?
I'd say the biggest difference from my perspective was both the use of cyber, the hacking, as a vehicle to physically gain access to information, to extract that information, and then to make it widely publicly available without any alteration or change.
And the only thing that I'd add is they were unusually loud in their intervention. It's almost as if they didn't care that we knew what they were doing or that they wanted us to see what they were doing. It was very noisy, their intrusions in different institutions.
And what specifically, based on this loudness, did the FBI or the NSA do to prevent or counter this Russian active measure that we read about in the intelligence community assessment? As loud as they were, what did we do to counter that?
Well, among other things, we alerted people who had been victims of intrusions to permit them to tighten their systems to see if they couldn't kick the Russian actors out. We also, as a government, supplied information to all the states so they could equip themselves to make sure there was no successful effort to affect the vote, and there was none, as we said earlier. And then the government as a whole, in October, called it out. And I believe it was Director Clapper and then Secretary Jay Johnson issued a statement saying this is what the Russians are doing, as sort of an inoculation.
And the loudness to which you refer, perhaps they were doing these kinds of actions previously in other elections, but they were not doing it as loudly. Why do you think that they did not mind being loud and being found out?
I don't know the answer for sure. I think their number one mission is to undermine the credibility of our entire democracy enterprise of this nation. And so it might be that they wanted us to help them by telling people what they were doing. Their loudness, in a way, would be counting on us to amplify it by telling the American people what we saw and freaking people out about how the Russians might be undermining our elections successfully. And so that might have been part of their plan. I don't know for sure.
I agree with Director Comey. I mean, a big difference to me in the past was while there was cyber activity, we never saw in previous presidential elections information being published on such a massive scale that had been, illegally removed, both from private individuals as well as organizations associated with the democratic process.